All right, welcome back, guys. Hopefully by now you've watched part two of the lecture, specifically the YouTube video that does a really nice job explaining the concept of intersectionality. So if you haven't watched that already, make sure you go back and watch that, probably before this one, so you have a good understanding of what it is for this component of the lecture. So last time I was here for a lecture, right, we talked a little bit about critical race theory and what it is and sort of why it's important, right? We talked about the fact that it illuminates this matrix of domination, right? And the fact that we need to look at how power is structured, and that by looking at how power is structured within society, we see that our identities actually kind of interact one another because they're all within that one matrix, right, within that society. So right now, we're going to talk about the concept of intersectionality, which is similar in many ways, but with a little bit of a different approach. So let's jump in and we'll start doing that. All right, so our discussion of intersectionality starts with Kimberly Crenshaw. She was born in 1959 and still alive, so she is also a contemporary theorist. She's a lawyer, a civil rights activist, and a leader of critical race theory. Right? And currently, she works as a professor at UCLA School of Law and Columbia Law. She is credited by coining the term intersectionality as well, and she's used within the legal field, but also obviously within the social fields. Right? So Crenshaw is a little bit different because she is a lawyer, but I think you're going to see a lot of her ideas are similar to what we talked about with Patricia Hill Collins as well. All right, so in 1989, Crenshaw wrote a book called Demarginalizing the Intersection of Race and Sex, a Black feminist critique of anti-discrimination doctrine, feminist theory, and anti-racist politics. So quite a long name. And in that, she starts to develop this framework of intersectionality and why it's important. Right? So before we talk about the ideas specifically in that book, I think it's important to also talk about the historical background of intersectionality. So intersectionality really is a reaction to second wave feminism. So the wave of feminism that happened between the 60s and the 80s. If you're unfamiliar with the different waves of feminism, it might be a good idea to go look them up online just to learn about how feminism has developed and look different generation to generation. So in the second wave of feminism, suffrage had been accomplished, right? Women had the right to vote, and we're now working on more issues that were plaguing women at that time. However, this wave of feminism was still largely focused on white women, okay, and white women's causes and their suffering in some way. So the question that people started to ask, right, during this wave of feminism and then after, is that how were Black women excluded from a social movement that was meant to include them, right? So theoretically, second wave feminism was meant to include Black women and women of color in their cause, right? But many of the time they were excluded, right? And the leading feminists of that era were largely white, at least the ones who were most in the public eye and advocating for women. Okay, so people started to ask essentially like, how do women of color fit into the story, and how are we not being represented the same as white women, right? So Angela Davis, who is a feminist icon, if you're not familiar with her, says this really well in this quotation here. And in reflecting on this feminist movement, she says, "Woman was the test, but not every woman seemed to qualify. Black women, of course, were virtually invisible within the protracted campaign for women's suffrage." All right, so theoretically, feminists were advocating for women's rights, but who was included in that umbrella term, women, was pretty much white women. Okay. Okay, so this sparks the idea of intersectionality. And essentially what intersectionality is exploring is how our social identities intersect, right, to create unique forms of discrimination. Okay, so essentially it's wondering what is our specific unique social location based on elements of our social identity. Okay, so for example, I am in a different, unique social location than someone who might look similarly to me on paper, right? Because I'm a product of how my gender is defined, how my sex is defined, my race, my class, my religion, my sexuality. Okay, so I'm in a very unique, particular social location because all of those different identities are intersecting together. And so even if I stand next to another woman, another white woman, right, our identities look different because all of these different factors make up our social location. Okay. So again, thinking about women's suffrage, right, even though the feminist movement was advocating for women's rights, it wasn't accounting for every woman within their specific location, right? So it was focused particularly on white women and wasn't accommodating women of different classes and different races, different religions maybe, etc. So if you think back to that YouTube video that you guys watched before this portion of the lecture, right, we have that metaphor of the traffic intersection, right? And so your experience within the social world, which is kind of what's happening in the middle of that intersection, right, might be influenced by your race at one point, right, might be influenced by your gender, okay, and how people interact with that. Sometimes it might be a combination of the two, right, that your experiences are gendered and raced at the same time and kind of create this unique experience. It might even be more experiences, right? So your ability or disability, right? Your religion, your social class, again, et cetera, et cetera. Lots of different social identities that we can think of. But the point being that our social location and our experiences are a product of the interaction between all of these different identities, right? So again, like we talked about with the matrix of domination, it's not enough just to compare differences between those experiences. We really need to look at how they're all multiplying and intersecting with one another at one given moment, at one given time. All right, so this might sound very similar to when we talked about the matrix of domination, but there's a few important differences here that I think are important to illuminate. Okay, so both intersectionality and the matrix of domination were derived from critical race theory. Okay, so they both come from the same origin and they're involved in the same conversations. The difference is really their level of analysis, their analytical lens. So intersectionality is really interested in social identities and specific social locations within the social world and the experiences that accompany that. The matrix of domination is more interested in the cultural and structural organization of power, right? So it's kind of like bumping up the level of analysis and looking less at experience and looking more at how power is organized within a society, right? So for example, an intersectional theorist might look at the experience of a Black woman in the workforce. Okay, so how is her interaction in a capitalist system influenced by her race and her gender? Versus someone using the matrix of domination might ask, how is racial and gender discrimination codified and defined in workplace policies? And how does that contribute to oppression? Right, so on one hand, we're focusing on experience, and the other hand, we're focusing on structure and organization of power, if that makes sense. So I want to look at a couple of case studies now just to see what this looks like in action and why it's important. Okay, so here I have an excerpt from Sojourner Truth's Ain't I a Woman speech that was delivered in 1851 at the Ohio Women's Convention. All right, so I'm not going to read this whole piece, but if you want to just like pause the video, take a second, and just read it through yourself. The main point of this speech, and that many of you may already know and be familiar with, right, is that this convention was in place to talk about women's rights and women's suffrage. And what Sojourner Truth is pointing out, right, is that not all of the women in this conversation are the same, right? So we've already been talking about this a little bit in regard to second wave feminism, right? But in this passage, she is pleading with the audience, right, that she is also a woman, but that really she has had a much worse experience than her white compatriots, right? Okay. So she says, nobody ever helps me into carriages or over mud puddles or gives me any best place, and ain't I a woman, right? Look at me, look at my arm. She's saying, you know, like, I'm a woman, and yet I'm not having the same experience as you. So what we see here, right, is this intersecting experience of race and gender, okay? This speech works because it's not Sojourner Truth just talking about her experience as a Black person, right, or her experience as a woman. The point of the speech is to say, because those two things intersect, I'm having a different experience than the rest of you, right? I am not benefiting the same from this movement as the rest of you, right? Because of that intersection of different identities defined by the system of power that we're in. Right, so let's look at some other examples that might feel of more contemporary relevance to some of you. So this graph is showing the rate of asthma by race and by poverty, okay? I don't know if you guys can see. Now, I think the screen might have cut it off, but this left side are the poorest segment of people. This is near poor, and these are non-poor people. Okay, so from the left, we're starting with most poor, and as we move right, we're getting less poor. All right, so asthma rates are broken up by poverty level and also by race, right? So in that deep tan, we have whites, in the orange, blacks, and then in the pink, we have Puerto Ricans. Okay. So we see a couple of things here, right? We see one, that poverty matters. Okay, so the poorer you are, the higher your rates of asthma. And when we talked about health inequality, we talked a little bit about this and some of the reasons why that would be, right? There might not be as much green space, less social mobility, so you can't move out of a bad neighborhood. Okay. So we see that poverty matters, but we also see that race matters, right? So, for example, Puerto Ricans have the highest rates of asthma, right? So over 20%, almost 25% of Puerto Rican children in the study, right, have asthma. Obviously, that decreases the less poor they become. Blacks are next, right, with the second highest, and then whites, right? So this is actually an intersectional approach to thinking about asthma outcomes, right? What we see is that social class matters a lot in asthma rates, and also race matters. It's not really enough to look at just one or the other, right? If we had just looked at poverty and we've gotten rid of these three different categories, it collapses and we'd see some correlation, right? But we wouldn't see the whole picture. And the same thing if we just looked at race, okay? So we would see that like whites have less asthma than blacks and Puerto Ricans, right? But again, we're not seeing that within those categories, there's also difference. So what we're seeing here is really actually an intersectional conclusion, which is that race and social class intersect in some interesting ways that determine and structure health outcomes. All right, so we've looked at this graph before, and this is the graph that shows obesity rates by income and by gender. Sorry, I need a drink of water. All right, so again, we start to see some interesting things here. We actually see that obesity isn't patterned so much for men, right? But it is patterned for women. And I think it's a little funny here. They talk about no obvious relationship, but clearly they're kind of favoring an analysis of the men in the study because there is some relationship for the women. We see that the poorest women are more obese and that the less poor they become, right, the less obese they are. Those obesity rates go down. So we know that social class matters here in determining obesity outcomes. But as I said, we also see that gender matters, right? If we looked at the poorest fifth of the population, right, that's a very big discrepancy between men and women's obesity. Similarly, when we look at the richest fifth, we also see some discrepancies, okay? And we see different discrepancies in the middle too. So again, what we're seeing here is that it's not enough just to look at social class. It's not enough just to look at gender, that we see very different things when we look at those two things, right? So if we only look at one, we're only getting part of the story, and we need to look at how those different social locations interact to determine a specific outcome. Right, so finally, this graph is showing us the probability that a first marriage will break up within 10 years, right? So kind of depressing if the other ones weren't already depressing. And again, we're looking at race here, and we're also looking at income level, right? So take a second and look at that. There's a lot of information here. All right, so what we see is, again, if you're richer, you're better off, right? That you're less likely to break up within your first 10 years of your marriage than you are if you're middle income or low income, right? So we know social class matters here. We also see that race matters a little bit, okay? So Hispanics do pretty well here, right? Non-Hispanic whites are a little bit more likely, right? Not necessarily if you're high income, but for middle income or low income, right, you're more likely to break up. And then non-Hispanic blacks are more likely than either group to break up within the first 10 years of their marriage. So again, what we're seeing here is that it's not just enough to look at social class or race, but that the two are interacting in some way. So that, for example, these middle income non-Hispanic whites are in a very particular social location that's different than high income whites, low income whites, middle income blacks, middle income Hispanics, etc. That the combination and the intersection of those two identities means a very particular experience, okay? And that those social locations can't be pulled apart from each other. They have to be seen together. All right, so that is intersectionality generally as a theory. I want to talk briefly about what intersectionality looks like in practice. So intersectional theorists talk a lot about how it's not just enough to study intersectionality, but to actually do intersectionality on a daily basis. And that can look a little bit different depending on your agenda. So the first is this call for intersectionality to be included within our activism, right? So if you go back to what we were talking about, the feminist movements, that feminism and all social movements need to be intersectional. Otherwise, you leave people out of that conversation, right? And you're actually just talking about one specific group's problems, white women's problems, upper class people's problems, for example. Okay, so within our activist work, we need to take an intersectional approach to recognize that within our social movement, there's a lot of different experiences, right, that need to be accommodated and looked at and catered to. We also need to incorporate intersectionality into our research methodologies, right? So when we're designing research projects, we need to design them in such a way that allows us to study multiple identities, right? So for example, say you're designing a project and you want to look at, I don't know, how Christians experience the world. Okay, if you're going to interview Christians, you need to make sure that you're interviewing people of a lot of different backgrounds, right? Not just men, not just women, but Christians of different races, right? Different sects, different classes, right? Because otherwise, you're actually just studying that one particular population. Okay? You need to think about what categories we want to pay attention to, what's important to us, and how do we represent everyone to accommodate those locations. Okay. This is particularly true for statistics, and I will say quantitative sociologists, I think, have the harder task here in collecting survey data that is representative of different intersectional experiences. And when you're doing statistical analysis, constructing your variables in such a way that they are intersectional and not just looking at one social identity. If you ever take a statistics course, you can talk a lot more about this, and it's a very complex topic that lots of people are doing some really good research in. So if you're interested in that, I highly recommend you pursue it because there's a lot to study here. Okay, so for today's discussion prompt, I'm asking you to think a little bit more about your own identity. So I want you to think, what are two or more social identities that you have? And then how do you think that they intersect or interact with each other And how does that make your experience of the social world different than someone who on paper might seem very similar to you? Okay, so for this discussion, just sort of reflect on your own experiences and how can we apply an intersectional approach to your own life. Okay, so as always, post your response within the discussion forum and make sure to respond to someone else's post as well. All right. So that's it. I'll see you guys in our next lecture. We're going to talk a little bit about social deviance.